We're here this afternoon to have a talk about our experiences with macrobiotics. And John Kozinski has had 40 years of experience as a teacher and counselor. 27 of those years were at the Kushi Institute. He is the only teacher who taught for 27 years of uninterrupted employment on the faculty as a teacher and counselor, which gave him a tremendous amount of experience in observing people, in counseling and teaching, because the Kushi Institute is unique in that the programs have run year-round for decades. So there was a volume of students and people going through there that I think is probably unprecedented in the world. There's really no other macrobiotic program that was open almost 365 days a year, maybe a couple of weeks each year. Some time would be taken off. So that's given John a good background in his understanding of macrobiotics today. And then Mirea, you have been doing this for over 30 years, is that right?
Well, I've been practicing macrobiotics. I actually started in, 1973. So that's quite a long time ago. I was teaching macrobiotics before I started being a manager at the Kushi Institute, which was over 30 years ago. And so 1982 is when I started at the Kushi Institute.
Okay, so that was with management, and then what year did you start teaching at the Kushi Institute?
I don't remember exactly, but probably about maybe 8 years after that.
Okay, so that was in the 90s. Yeah.
That's right.
Okay, so we have a lot of experience here, and I'll just mention that I also worked at the Kushi Institute for a period of time, and I've been working with John in his private macrobiotic practice where he teaches and counsels across the United States, and you can learn more about that at the macrobiotic.com website. So what we want to do today is bring macrobiotics into present times. What has really happened over the past, well, we could really look at the past 20 years in Beckett, in your experience, because I've noticed that there's a lot of opinions about what works in macrobiotics and what doesn't work in macrobiotics, but often the people who put the information out haven't had the direct experience that you have had with people. So I think we can start with maybe first giving your current definition of what is macrobiotics. And you want to start, John?
Well, the definition I've been using for a while, with a little variation, is macrobiotics is the way of healthy longevity that occurs in all different parts of our life, the body, the mind, and the spirit, based upon a sustainable form of health, long-lasting health in all those areas, by following the principles of balance in the different parts of our lives. Those different parts of our daily lives, particularly diet, lifestyle, attitude, thinking. And if balance in this sense means that something that creates a sustainable state where these areas can progress, because without a certain continual health, of course, you can't make it to longevity. And this, there's a lot of evidence around the world that people who took care of these parts of their lives in cultures around the world that have been studied created a healthy longevity. About, I think, 12, maybe 13 cultures have been studied. And so the tradition is there, and the teaching around the world has been a tradition, not only in these places, but other places that foster that state of, longevity, the way of longevity.
So how is that different from what your definition of macrobiotics was when you first became a teacher and counselor, and when did it change, if it changed at all?
Well, I think I don't know if I can remember back that long, but if I can remember back to what my definition was. But what I think I discovered over the years is that the way that things like a macrobiotic approach, over the years I've felt that there's a macrobiotic approach to things. But the way that modern macrobiotics took, the direction it took was to create a system that everybody should follow. The same system, same way of eating, the same lifestyle practices. To some extent, there's some way of thinking too about health. And it was kind of like a one-size-fits-all. And what I discovered over the years is a couple of things, many inconsistencies with what real longevity or real health is created by. One of them is by comparing these cultures around the world. They ate many of the foods that I originally was recommending and modern macrobiotics has recommended, but they also ate foods that have been demonized, that were felt to be essential. In classes I talk about, surprising people, that there's two sacred foods in traditional cultures. One of the sacred foods, or one of the foods that is the darling of modern macrobiotics, that's grains. And that was the reason it was a sacred food, because it was felt essential and it was really hard to produce compared to other foods. So it took a lot of effort, and so you knew that there was something important about that. But the other sacred food is the food that has been left out of modern macrobiotic eating that was considered essential, and that was animal foods. And animal foods, like grains, and in fact even more than grains, take even more effort to produce or to catch. So you knew there was something important to them, and it turns out that this is not the only thing that has been left out of the modern macrobiotic approach to eating, but it is a substantial thing, because over the years, one of the things I discovered, and I think many people have just noticed, that as people do this for 30, 40 years, more and more people are getting sick, or not feeling well. And some people, passed away from serious illnesses that were not supposed to happen, at least not in the teaching. And part of that, I believe, is from some nutritional deficiencies related to leaving out these very sacred foods in traditional cultures, the natural animal foods, naturally raised or wild animal foods. And lip service was given that you needed a little bit of them, but it turns out if you look at the traditional cultures, they valued so much that mostly they were eaten on a daily basis. Unless people couldn't afford them, they were eaten on a daily basis. And what I discovered over the years of studying many different angles of food, and one of them being nutrition, is that these foods were valued by certain cultures because they were considered so energy dense. And from a modern perspective, they're incredibly nutrient dense, with certain vitamins and certain proteins that you can't get from other foods. So in a big sense, you could say they were complementary to the plant foods. A friend of mine said recently, there's all this talk about plant-based diets, but what they're really talking about is plant-exclusive. And traditional cultures were plant-based. They ate a lot of plants, the grains and vegetables, but they also valued their animal foods. And we know that there's certain nutrients that you can't get from other foods that are really important.
Okay, so you said if people could afford to eat the animal foods, and so does what people eat around the world evolve from what is available locally? When we talk traditional anyway, today foods are moved all over the world, but you would be eating what was available locally, but most importantly, what you could afford to eat. So do you think some of the styles of diets that evolved over the centuries in different parts of the world were really evolving more for economic reasons? In other words, what could be fed to the people in that area of the world for economic reasons?
Well, I think there's a part of that. dietary teachings, I think reflect a lot of different aspects of culture, and I know that in places in the world where people can't afford to eat as much animal food, there's some statistic that they don't live as long. The places where there's poverty. Now, poverty has a lot of different effects, but one of the effects is they can't get enough food. And animal food is usually, even dairy food in India, is available more for people who can afford it. And then you go to the poor places and they have much less longevity, they die younger when they can't, but they can't afford all food. And animal food is one of them. I think some dietary teachings to the public, when I've studied about Chinese medicine, some people will talk about how in Chinese culture they recommend eating animal food 2 or 3 times a week. But that's for the people, I think that was a teaching for the common people. If they're wealthy, they didn't eat it 2 or 3 times a week. They ate it every day. And in Japan, interesting enough that you go back a couple of centuries, the emperor's family had cows. So, they even had dairy food. And so I think around the world you've always had that dichotomy, but I don't know if it was all in the health teachings. But there has been, the modern macrobiotics teachings in food have had an element where they've basically done something that has become very popular, and that is the romanticization of poverty. So the poverty diets were considered, to be the diets that we should eat, just grains and vegetables. But if you go to all those places in the Far East, they always valued some amount of animal food, and they had ways to do it so that they could actually stretch it a little bit, like in Vietnam, like having the soup with the whole animal, and other cultures too.
Okay, so Mirea, has your definition of macrobiotics changed from the early days to the present day, and your application?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd have to say that when I started Macrobiotics, when I picked up the book of Macrobiotics, and read it, I was doing so because I was sick. And I read the book, and a lot of it just didn't make sense to me or feel important to me. And so what I did is I simply got a cookbook, and I started practicing. And right away, I felt a tremendous amount better. I would say like 99% better within a week. And I realized that I had been depressed before that week of macrobiotics, which was in my early 20s. And all of a sudden, I was so happy I could look back and say it was not only physical, but it was mental. So I would say that my definition of macrobiotics is, how can we ourselves take charge of our health and use diet, lifestyle, and attitude to create really vibrant, really optimal health? Because that's what we need to live happily, to have a fulfilling life, to do the things we need to do, that we want to do, to have a really enjoyable life. And yet, I had some challenges with many macrobiotic teachers and some of the principles, because I found it was so exclusive and judgmental that I would go and visit some macrobiotic people in a certain area, and they were talking about how, oh, that person isn't macrobiotic because they put cinnamon in their cookies. And I thought that was so insane. And we know that, there is such a bounty of incredibly nutritious, incredibly valuable food all over the planet. And so what I did is I was very into experimentation and what makes me feel good, what gives me health. And yet I was following a basic, plan in macrobiotics, even maybe just a bit wider than some people, but a basic plan. And what I discovered is that even though my first initial symptoms, which were huge allergies, had gone away, I started getting other illnesses on macrobiotics. And eventually I traced that myself because the macrobiotic teachers I had queried didn't have any answers for my various problems. Inflammation, environmental sensitivities, and various problems which were actually more debilitating than the allergies. I traced it myself to gluten and got the gluten out, and that was fine. And then after that, I had exhaustion. And I had not been to doctors for a long time because I hadn't needed them, but my exhaustion wouldn't go away. I had tried different things, once again queried certain macrobiotic counselors. And eventually, I had a blood test. Because I do value science's ability to tell me what's going on in my body when I couldn't figure it out. Right? And I found that my pancreas wasn't working very well because I was producing very little insulin. I had tremendously high blood sugar, even though I ate nothing with added sugar. I prepared my food from fresh whole foods. I had a variety of grains, beans, nuts, seeds, fruits, sea vegetables, and some fish, small amount of fish each week. And I said to myself, it isn't working for me. And rather than going to, back to the doctor and saying I need, to do whatever, medications, I know that nature often has the answer. And I was willing to do whatever it took. So in experimentation, I tried different things, and then I started adding animal products, including chicken, which was, in Kushi land, a taboo, in Kushi Institute. And guess what? My blood sugar problem stopped because my pancreas started producing insulin, which in medical terms, doesn't happen. And so I felt really great about that. And I had been listening to John for years, and he had recommended books like the Weston Price book, which I found fascinating. And to me, macrobiotics has principles that I can use to explore, not something that limits me. But most people I have met in macrobiotics, not John, but most people, really take that, one might call it a philosophy, and try to justify it in terms of if someone is not healthy, well, they obviously weren't doing it right. And yet we know that macrobiotics seems to work for some people, like for me a certain amount of time. But in my years of teaching at Kushi Institute, and years before that, I observed that, like me, it didn't work for everyone for a long time for a couple of reasons. One is that it just didn't work, but another reason was that the way it was being taught at Kushi Institute, in my observation, wasn't sustainable. One of the other myths in macrobiotic, and it's not as if it's not somewhat true, is that everything should be cooked fresh. And in today's world, where there's no one cooking at home for me, So I was, right from the beginning, using what I call a judicious use of leftovers. In terms of I would make my own food, but I would make enough to last for at least a few meals, if not more. So I took what worked in macrobiotics for me, but I was always willing to adjust it to what would work for me, even if it wasn't what was recommended. And so I would say that macrobiotics has greatly benefited me because every time I've had a challenge, I've been able to overcome it. But I've had an open mind about it. Like John, I really admire John a lot because he's always investigating, always learning more, and he and I have come to similar conclusions. And I came to the conclusion that if I was eating such a varied macrobiotic diet, and yet my pancreas wasn't working, and I add animal products, and my pancreas recovers, my conclusion was that I was deficient. And I've seen so many people in macrobiotics that it wasn't working for them, but they would say, but I have to follow my counselor's advice, how could I know? And I would say that we are all so wise when we listen to our bodies. So I would say macrobiotics, to me, a definition, is whatever is going to give us optimal health, physically, mentally, spiritually, whatever we want whatever we want. And for that, you can't have it if you're deficient. I also include attitude, the people that weren't willing to do what it took. You know, if this isn't working, try something else. Attitude is so important. And when you look at the health crisis in the United States, I think there are so many people that are just, you know, they're so busy, they're eating processed food, and if Macrobiotics cannot embrace the lifestyle that people have and make it doable for them, no one can be in the kitchen all day cooking food. So unless we can show them a way to eat healthy food and have a life too.
Yes, very important.
It's so important. So for me, there's no really necessarily simple definition of macrobiotics. But I would say that when you give the body what it needs, when you figure out what that is, in food, in emotions, in attitude, and lifestyle. I know so many macrobiotic people that would spend all day cooking, but they wouldn't exercise. And what do we need for optimum health? We need it all. And when we give ourselves what we need, we have joy, we have energy, so that the rest of our life becomes easier. Does that make sense?
It sure does. And so I'm thinking from what both of you have said that macrobiotics, the word, does imply it's a longevity teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And of course that goes back to really Hippocrates.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't really something that came out of Eastern teachings,
Mm-hmm.
but there were Eastern teachers who then took that and created a macrobiotic approach. Now we're at a point of looking at what has worked in modern times with that approach, which was revolutionary for its time when it came to the United States decades ago. But now we have a lot of evidence of what's worked from that and what has not, from people like you and John, who have actually been engaged with people every day of your life, working with people to help people using these vegan-style macrobiotic dietary approaches that were taught at the Kushi Institute. But a time came when you felt that that was not working in a way that you could continue teaching, so you're evolving the teachings. So it's still a longevity teaching, and I know the way that John teaches it, it's based on the principles of balance, which is, you know, terms that are used in Eastern teachings. But he's also incorporating sustainability. So, and that's what you're talking
Exactly.
about, sustainable eating. So it's a longevity teaching, a sustainable longevity teaching, using principles of balance. And John teaches that. He can teach that from a yin-yang perspective. He can teach it from a contraction and expansion explanation of things going on in the body. And then it can be taught in terms of our interaction with the world at large and the opposites that are occurring at all times in our daily life, in our relationships, our emotions. So we're always trying to make a balance with these energies that
That's so true.
really control our well-being, how we balance those energies.
Jeanette, I'd like to just say one thing quickly about the longevity. I'm pretty sure that people in the United States are living longer than ever before. And it's the quality of life, to me, that's more important, because they're living longer because they're being kept alive by medicine, but they're in tremendous pain. They're not functioning well. They're not happy. They wanted to retire and go on trips, but instead they're feeling miserable, and they might have great caretakers, but they're not healthy. And I want to make a differentiation between longevity and healthy longevity.
Very important, very important.
And because of that, even though we can say macrobiotics is, you could say long life, but I like macro in terms of big life or great life, because I don't want to just have a long life, I want to have a great life. And I feel that that is what my being able to understand how to work with food, lifestyle, and attitude has brought to me.
Yeah, excellent. And actually, John talks about this a little bit too. You make a joke about, what is it, John? Are you living longer, or?
Does it seem longer? there's a point though, it's great to hear your story, and there's one point that I think that, just listening to the story, that many of us will think of macrobiotics as the diet that we learned when we started. You know, it was about the same time I started to eat this way, and I felt after a few weeks really great. I had dabbled in vegetarian eating before that and felt good doing that, but you know, too much wine and bad cheese probably was, and donuts were doing me, you know, not so well. And so I changed to like a more almost totally vegan style macrobiotic eating. And for many years I thought that was macrobiotics. Although I think now that that kind of macrobiotic eating is one style of macrobiotic eating, which I call a fasting diet. And the fasting diet can have, you know, benefits for a lot of different reasons. One is because you get away from junk and you start to eat there's quite nutritious food there. In the long run though, and I understand why we do this, because I could see after teaching many years that it's really important to offer guidelines for people who are coming from the modern diet and healthy diets, which are so confusing. My sense now is that a macrobiotic way of eating, the best way to teach that is to teach it in a way that is a broader way than a more narrow way, and if people want to make it more narrow for whatever health reasons, they can do that. But that would include like all kinds of various grains, tubers, you know, which sometimes certain foods have been demonized in modern macrobiotics, but they're really healthy cultures eating potatoes, sweet potatoes. People eating all kinds of vegetables, both cooked and raw. People eating all kinds of natural animal food. Some cultures eating natural dairy food, which some people can do well with, some people may not, but you know, beans were actually minor parts of most traditional diets, but they were there, and all kinds of other natural foods like seasonings and fruits, local fruits, and some other fruits that they would eat, and sweeteners and beverages and teas. I think if the diet is presented in a more broad way, it becomes a bigger door, easy to get into. There's
Absolutely.
some of my classes I talked about this just because of my casual studies of Buddhism, you know, that there's there's a big door and a small door Buddhism. Buddhism, the Eastern religion, philosophy, religion, and the big door was that you didn't have to do much to be helped. Like, so they would have, you'd say the name of Buddha and you'd be helped. So anybody could do that, you know, it's very easy to do, so that's a big door. And then the small door is that basically you have to really study all the traditions, and it's more esoteric Buddhism, where you have to study and learn and understand and practice. And not too many people get in that door, because it's a small door. I think that there's been a big door and a small door, but in a different way in macrobiotics. The small door is that everybody has to eat this real narrow way. And if you don't eat that narrow way, then you're not eating macrobiotically, and that's the one promoted in the books. The big door is that people could eat traditional based foods, yes, whole grains and vegetables and beans, but also natural animal foods and natural sweets and mild spice and herbs and things that people did traditionally, and make the food very delicious, not bland. And that's a big door. And I think that, you know, I think that's the future, you know, the macrobiotic understanding, that we make a big door there and even apply that to different things. And recently I wrote an article, and in the article I was talking about how every food has its benefit. Every natural food has its benefit, but we've demonized certain foods. Even sugars have their benefit. Even white sugar has its medicinal value for some cases. When someone has been starving and malnourished and they need calories, that'll even have a benefit for them. I haven't found a benefit of high fructose corn syrup, but that's maybe somewhere. But you know, all foods have natural benefits, and if we offer this wider perspective, and also recognize that people can incorporate all kinds of things and understand how it may be good for them. You know, so that it's not just, you know, I think Mirea would know about this because, you know, there was some point that people, some of the teachers would even demonize doing vigorous exercise.
Oh,
You know, that was,
yes.
it would make you too tense or too tight, especially women. And
especially women.
yeah, especially women. And you know, I came to realize the reason after I changed my diet years ago and I started incorporating some natural animal foods along with, you know, my grains and vegetables, started eating some natural eggs and fish more, that all of a sudden I got interested in studying exercise and some vigorous exercise, certain kinds of martial arts. Then I realized that the people who were saying don't exercise vigorously couldn't.
Right, they didn't have the energy for
They
it.
didn't have the energy to, so that's why. And I was kind of saying that too, but I didn't have the energy for it. I always liked exercise, but once I changed, I had a lot of energy for it.
I'd like to say something about that, because I decided that just last year, I had been in macrobiotics for so many years and investigated scientific literature too on diet. I always wanted to learn everything, but I actually took the year off to go to college, to a fitness program to learn how the body works, because I realized that even though I would do some exercise in my directing and managing the institute, in my teaching, I was sitting down too much. And I realized that my vitality wasn't as strong as I wanted it to be. And I decided to change my career to incorporate fitness. So I didn't want to do it without really knowing what I was doing. And I went to college and took these college courses. And one of the first things they talked about was the energy systems, the energy pathways. Because we always say, well, sugar gives us energy, right? We need sugar. We do need blood sugar, but there are different energy pathways. And then if someone wants to do really fast, quick energy, the body doesn't use sugar, it uses creatine. And I had my computer at every class, you know, and I said, creatine, you know, I haven't actually studied that. I wonder what plant sources we get that from. So I typed in, you know, where do we get creatine? It isn't in any plant source. It's only in animal sources. And so I said, you know, I've added animal products, I've healed my pancreas, but I want to be able to do whatever kind of energy and have that energy to move quickly if I want to. You know, not to say I'm going to have a career as a sprinter or anything, but it was another way of understanding that the body is so complex. And the more I studied the science of how the body works, the more I realized how important it is to have the broadest amount of foods to give us the nutrients we need. We are complex. We need to have a more complex diet. And I think that when you look at the SAD, Standard American Diet, SAD diet, they also have a limitation, like the way macrobiotics was being taught. Far too few foods. They might have meat, but then they don't have so many things that we've been doing in macrobiotics. And in combining macrobiotics, just making it broader gives us the ability to have extraordinary health and vitality. So we can do, and so now I'm doing much more physical activity and feeling the benefits.
And that's what it's all about. I know I came to Macrobiotics after watching my father suffer and die from colon cancer. And so my coming was for the alleviation of suffering, to help find a way. And interestingly, John was just telling me about a link that he found between sitting and diabetes.
Yes.
And the development of diabetes. And also not only broadening our food choices, but broadening our understanding through study. Not just accepting what somebody says, but which is what we did for many years. We just, because it sounded good and there was a lot wrong and there was no other answer out there, so
Very
we were
true.
on board. And I mean, I remember when my father got sick, people were still saying, and he passed away in 1984, people were still saying at that time, how could something like that happen to such a good man? Why doesn't it happen to the bad person down the road? He's so good. So there was no understanding of the link between environmental toxins and diet
Very
and
true.
disease, you know, then. Of course, it had been going on in macrobiotics and some other natural approaches, but on a very small scale. So the general public was still in that mindset. Now in the area that, and in the hospital, one of the hospitals my father was in, they now have a big alternative medicine center. So times are very different now.
That's right.
So what was being taught in macrobiotics during that time, there really wasn't much else. So you know, if you wanted to try to find a way to address these tragedies that, you know, people were experiencing with their family members, this was a way.
You know, that is so true. Back in the days, you know, 40 years ago, there really was so little knowledge and education. And if something worked for us even temporarily, we'd have to cling hold on that. And nowadays, though, with the internet, where we can research, and through our experience, I mean, we would call people to see how they were doing sometimes at Kushi Institute. Just call the last, 6 months or years of people that had been in the program. And what we found was that so many people didn't stick to the program. They weren't able to do that. Right? And so to me, the curiosity is, why can't they stick to it? That's very multifaceted. But we have the potential to help so many people, and we do need to do constant research. We need to find out as much as possible and there's no such thing as we have the answer, the one answer, the only answer. It's a constant learning process. So how can we improve the diet? How can we improve the exercise? How can we improve stress reduction? How can we have this more acceptable that people's friends accept it, because people do need love and companionship. And so the more we learn, the more we're flexible too, the more we're able to help people. I want to say one thing about longevity though. I am going to be 64 in a month. And when I meet people my age out in the world, generally people nowadays are not healthy in their 60s. Wouldn't you say that's true?
That's something that I've been thinking about because we've had so many macrobiotic teachers who were teaching the supposed perfect diet and the vegan macrobiotic style.
Yes.
And they've passed away from cancer.
Yeah.
They've passed away from heart disease.
Yeah.
And so where is we're not seeing the longevity, but where we are seeing the longevity is in the older generation who was not eating macrobiotically, but many of them in their 80s, 90s, and over 100, their diets were more natural than the diets that even we started out on. Even if our parents cooked every day, we still were in the age of the wonder of frozen foods and canned foods and lots of candy and desserts and processed foods coming in. So it seems like they have the longevity from, they probably had a balanced, more natural diet that included everything.
That's true, and not so much chemicals. And they were more active.
Yes.
They were more active. They say that the generation growing up today is probably going to be the first generation that doesn't outlive their parents. I would say not only macrobiotic people in their 60s are not necessarily doing so well, but I would say the general population.
Yes.
And so I believe that there are answers, and that people like John and myself and others that are willing to really seek out to combine science and research with principles, and to be willing to look at it truly holistically, can provide doable, wonderful answers.
Yes, and John, I wanted to ask you, there are a lot of people who are following a vegan-style diet now because it's popular. And often, and I see a lot, I think a lot of this came out of not just the macrobiotic movement, but also the yoga movement, which is huge.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people, you know, even yoga practitioners who have really worked on their bodies in combination with eating this kind of diet are having problems. As a matter of fact, a famous author just said to me recently, who was teaching at a yoga ashram, that the older yoga teachers, the women, looked terrible. He said they looked all dried out.
Mm-hmm.
And however, because people have been practicing these diets for so long, it's almost as though an eating disorder develops.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think almost as if an eating disorder actually does develop, where even though they're not doing well, they have
They will
built up
change.
all these reasons
Yes.
why they
Mhm.
cannot make the change. And then on top of it, I've learned through my own experience and what John has been teaching me, your digestive system can become very compromised from a vegan diet. And you have to actually rebuild that in order to be able to eat and digest the foods that you need to take you out of the mode that is putting you in really a deficient health state and a lot of suffering,
Yeah.
low energy, not feeling well, people having pain. So I think there's one thing that people will often say, which Mirea said too, when she first started, she felt so good. I had that experience too. And often later on when people aren't doing well, they always want to go back to what they were doing because at that time they felt so good. So they think that that's what's going to be the answer for them in the present time when they're having a problem, when in fact it isn't. And I know that you have studied about why people get that. It's almost a high feeling of well-being. They feel so good when they go on this fasting style approach. And I think maybe you can explain why you call it a fasting approach in terms of calorie intake and the studies and research that has been done around that, and what really is a more reasonable amount of calories for people.